I'd like to welcome you to the first of 4 Hangouts on Air presentations. They'll all be relatively short presentations to get you through some of the basics associated with Hangouts on Air. And with this, we should be able to take a look at Hangouts on Air. The goal for Hangouts on Air is to be able to provide basic understanding of the capabilities. Why are we doing this? Hangouts on Air can be used to attend business meetings virtually when you're unable to attend physically. Maybe you had to stay home or your coach is broken down somewhere. It gives you another way to still make those associated business meetings at the international rallies. In addition, Hangouts on Air is an excellent platform to provide a video record of any of the seminars that are presented at many of those international rallies, which will allow us to maintain an archive and provide another value add for our membership. Hangouts on Air is actually composed of 3 programs: Google Mail, Google Plus, and YouTube. The 3 combine to generate a Hangouts on Air session. Now, the 4th icon that you see on here is actually Google Chrome. In truth, we can use any of 4 compatible browsers. We can utilize a Mozilla browser, we can utilize Safari, Internet Explorer, or Google Chrome. But it's kind of a no-brainer. All of these other applications are Google applications. It makes sense that the most compatible browser will be Google Chrome. So wherever possible, if you're hosting or attending a Hangout on Air session as a presenter or as a panelist or participant, it's a good idea to have Google Chrome loaded on whatever you're using, whether it's a computer, a laptop, a smartphone, or a tablet. As far as basic presentation assumptions, before I started this presentation, I'm kind of making the assumption that you've completed the registration process for Gmail, Google+, and your YouTube channel. Your Gmail, Google+, and YouTube accounts are active was a second assumption. And the third is that you've had the time or the opportunity to participate in a one-on-one Hangout on Air orientation that gives you a basic layout for the screen. Now, one of the things that was done in setting all of this up was to set up the account names based on the officer positions, like Beaver Ambassador Club President or Past President, and so on. The reason for that is because there's a term on all of these positions, and at the end of the term, this allows you to hand off these accounts to your successor. It also means that if you've maintained any records in Gmail associated or in Mail associated with your particular position, you can hand those off as well. And in addition, it means that you can keep your Mail account separated so that you're not always commingling personal information with club business. Hangouts on Air invitations. When you are a participant or a guest in a Hangout on Air session, you'll receive a Gmail telling you about it, and that'll be placed in the social tab in Gmail. You'll also get a notification in Google+. We'll go into that in some detail later on, just not right now. As to how these things are sent out, usually we'll invite people in a circle. Now, what a circle is, it's a group identifier. It enables a user to organize people into groups or lists for sharing. And it can be used across a variety of Google products and services. Once it's created, a user can share specific private content to one or more specific circles. So we've set up a Beaver Ambassador or BAC circle. Beaver Ambassador Club themed content can be shared with a group of your colleagues that are in that particular circle. You can also share with the public that option is always available. If we look at what Google Plus circles are, what I've done is you'll notice that in this screenshot, you'll see a Google Plus entry, and it points to people. So there's a drop-down menu. I simply selected people, and it identifies all of the people I have associated with this particular user, the user that's identified in the circle in the upper right-hand corner. We'll see the Beaver moderator, Region 4 Vice President. Actually, these are all of the people that I have in all of the circles. One of them is a family member. 14 of them are in a group called BAC, which is for the Beaver officers, and I've got a separate group for members, and that group, I figure, over time will grow significantly in size. Now, when I select a particular group like BAC, then I see the 14 officers associated with that group. So you can select by group, you can pull up multiple groups, you can create more groups if you like. The final piece of information that's kind of important to us, and that's a little different that you may not have had in the past, is each one of your officer positions has a YouTube channel associated with it. So not only do you have a login in YouTube, you have your own channel. What this allows you to do is create and store videos that are up to 8 hours in length. And they can be visible to the public at large. You can restrict them so that they're only visible to those folks who happen to have the associated URL to point to them, or you can make them totally private. So again, it gives you a good bit of flexibility. Your particular YouTube channel is also where you might go about editing any YouTube videos that you've generated. At least you can edit them online if they're less than 2 hours in length. If they're longer than that, it's necessary to download them, do your editing, and upload them again. Let's get down to the 4 objectives for this material. The first objective is to determine the bandwidth and usage requirements for Hangouts on Air, and that's what we're going to do in this first of 4 presentations. The second objective is to look at the elements and the thoughts behind what you use for lighting, for cameras, and for audio. And we also want to look at the issues associated with those. We want you to be able to identify Hangouts on Air elements and the associated applications that you'll use as a host, and that is if you start a presentation as a host / moderator, and as a participant, or participant / panelist if you like, or as a presenter. So if you're presenting a seminar topic, you would come in pretty much like a panelist. We'll walk you through the Hangout on Air setup, and that's the basic setup to start a session and what's necessary for you to join an existing session as a participant. So those are the 4 elements or 4 objectives that we have. We'll address one objective in each of the 4 videos. To begin with, let's talk about your bandwidth requirements. For video conferencing through YouTube, the minimum outbound from a participant is 300 kilobits. Minimum inbound is 300 kilobits. These are bare minimums that are necessary to establish a connection. The ideal bandwidth for the best experience is about 2.6 megabits per second, both outbound and inbound, and that'll generate a high definition screen. And we'll look at those screen sizes because that can affect bandwidth and usage requirements as well. And with group calls of more than 2 people, you can expect bandwidth usage to go up. So for example, with 10 participants, we're looking to use about 4 megabits a second, which is a pretty good chunk, and it can actually climb up to around 4.5 megabits a second. Those are the basic production bandwidth requirements. In terms of bandwidth settings, they are adjustable. There's 4 settings, and they're adjustable by hitting the bandwidth symbol there, which is the 4th symbol from the left. And what that does is it allows you to change to one of four settings. We can set it at auto high definition, which was intended for quad-core processors, but it works fine with dual-core processors. Low speed, which means that we'll use up to 500 kilobits in our uplink and downlink presentation. And that's basically the old 640 by 480 display. Yeah. The audio only is 35 kilobits up and down. So if you're attending as a participant and you know that there's something that you have to say, but you don't have to present any particular documents, you can come in at 35 kilobits and still participate. These are the basic production bandwidth requirements. Again, you can access those settings at the top of the screen by clicking on the bandwidth icon. Once you click on that icon, it's kind of, think of it as a sticky button, in that it will stay in whatever setting you leave it in until you change it again. So it defaults to Auto HD. If you change it to, let's say, low, close the session, come back into another session, it will be defaulted to low. So this is something you want to look at as you come in. Now, in terms of, we've talked about bandwidth requirements in terms of kilobits or megabits per second. How does that equate to data usage? Well, if I were running a display that's, say, 640 by 360, I'm going to run somewhere between 600K and a megabit per second. So I checked some locations. When I looked at Geeks on Tour, they were averaging about 740 kilobits per second, or 333 megabits of usage per hour. In my tests, I used a cable connection, and it averaged download speeds of 3 megabits a second, or it averaged download speeds much higher than 3 megabits per second, but I actually used 3 megabits per second, or I was using about 1.35 gigabits of data per hour on the Auto HD display. That's acceptable when you're tied to a cable modem or have a Wi-Fi, a high-speed Wi-Fi connection available. When I did my second test, I limited that speed to slow, which is 500 kilobits, and it utilized about 225 megabytes of data per hour. And that seemed to be an acceptable speed. You've got a bit of downgrade in video quality. If you can live with that, fine. If not, that's okay too. In terms of how do we determine how much data we're using, dependent upon our pixels of resolution and our resolution. So how big is the screen and how many pixels are we looking at per inch, and how big is the screen and what's the resolution. The video bit rates based on that specific resolution are kind of interesting. In a 640 by 360 display, which is completely adequate, we use up to a maximum about a megabit per second, and we use a minimum of about 400 kilobits a second. So on the usage side, that means we're going to use up to 338 megabits per hour. At the highest possible speed with a very high speed connection, we'll utilize about 2 gigabits per hour in a 1920 by 1080 display. The reference for this is the YouTube live streaming guide, and it's the live encoder settings that list the bit rates and the resolutions. Maximum playback speeds then are also determined by video resolution. So if you reduce the video resolution, you're going to also reduce the speed. Now, the first thing that we have to do since we're concerned with bandwidth, is we're going to have to condition the site. We're going to have to make sure that there's sufficient bandwidth available, and we do that with a speed test. Speed test is a website. It's at www.speedtest.net. When you're at a campground that you're planning on doing a presentation at, it's a good idea to run a speed test. Or if you're not there, you might give the campground host a call and ask to give you the results from a speed test. I think what I'm going to do is take us out of this presentation for a moment and take us into see what an actual speed test looks like. So why don't we do that? Yeah, here's a speed test. So now if I begin the test and it tells me that I'm sitting here, it says Cocoa, I'm actually in Titusville. But if I go ahead and begin the test, it's going to select the so-called best servers. So it'll grab a server in the Orlando area, and I don't know where this one is. Not yet, anyway. And then it'll give me some idea what my download and upload speeds are. So my download speed happens to be about 13.5 megabits per second, and my upload speed looks a little on the slow side. It's going to be a little above 2 megabits per second, 2.11 in fact. So that's what I happen to be running right now. Now if I take us back to the other presentation, now if there's no Wi-Fi available in the area you're at, you're probably going to have to rely on cellular or cellular data. And to do that, we verify them with a smartphone app called Coverage Map, or we go to the RootMetrics website at webcoveragemap.rootmetrics.com in the US, and then input the location we want to look at, and it'll give us a sense of what's available. In this particular example that I'm showing here, what I'm actually using is the Kerrville location where the Hill Country Rally is going to be held. What we're looking at here is the best technology found, which is LTE, 2G, 3G, so on, and the networks. So what RootMetrics does is lists all of the networks. I happen to be connected to AT&T at the time, but if I were to connect to Verizon, I can see Verizon's map for the same area, and it doesn't seem to have quite the results of the AT&T map in this particular case. That certainly won't be the same situation everywhere. But what we want to do is look at the technology. Not so much the call performance. We're more concerned with data than with voice. If those results don't help you identify when you zoom in, and I'm going to zoom in and show you that there's a bit of a problem here because there just isn't enough test results in the area. Then what we want to do is we want to go to OpenSignal. And OpenSignal allows us to look at that same thing, that same physical location. We can look at it from a coverage standpoint, which is what you're seeing here, or more importantly in this case, we can get some idea of where the towers are physically located. It's not so important to see who owns the towers as it is to see what whether they're physically relatively close by. That again is done on the OpenSignal site, and by the way, there's an OpenSignal app that will allow you to do the same thing. Simply plug in the address and you can gain some information about them. Not great, but it's the best information available at the time. So that brings us back, and we'll continue on. We've already talked about OpenSignal. So that pretty much wraps up the first objective. You want to be able to determine the bandwidth and the usage requirements for Hangouts on Air. And by the way, these usage requirements are usage to run a presentation. They're not exactly the same requirements that you use for streaming. That is, when you're viewing a presentation after the fact, you're actually streaming that data. And again, it's going to depend on the window size associated with the data that you're streaming from YouTube. In the next session, we'll talk about the light setup, the cameras, the audio, and the issues that we have with those. So with that, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and stop this presentation. So go on and take a look at part 2 of the broadcast. Thanks. Have a great afternoon.